I think we can all agree that the subject of calculation in chess is one of utmost importance, yet it is also the subject that is most misunderstood. You would not think that is the case after everything that has been said and written about it. You would certainly not think that would be true after a masterpiece on calculation like the book Think Like a Grandmaster by Alexander Kotov exists. A book that explains in depth the process via which a grandmaster calculates in practice. And you can, of course, agree or disagree whether the book is a masterpiece or if it has any value at all. And I think in order to understand why the widespread negativity and criticism towards the book are deeply unfounded and, in my opinion, completely unfair, we need to take a look at who Alexander Kotov was first. I just want to mention that the purpose of this video is not to defend Kotov or his method, but to explain why a method of calculation in chess is the wrong starting point when it comes to improving your calculation. It is to provide an explanation of the missing link or the skill that you need to have in order to be able to not only use Kotov's method, but any other method of calculation. So that is the main purpose of this video. So let's have a look at who Kotov was. Alexander Kotov was USSR chess champion and at one time the number 6 player in the world. I think this is important, and it is here that we need to stop and think. Number 6 is quite an achievement, and the question is if the present number 6, who is Maxim Vashilograph at the time of making this video, wanted to share with the world his method of calculation, would we want to hear what he had to say? Kotov's book, which was published several decades ago, currently has 13 reviews on Amazon, which means that it is not the most popular chess book out there. In fact, what this tells us is that when something this old and this famous has such number of reviews, its validity or usefulness can neither be rejected nor accepted by the reader, who, being intelligent enough to understand the complexity of the subject, is careful not to jump to conclusions. So why is it then that most people cannot make up their mind about Kotov's work? It's because, in my view, they never actually tried to work with Kotov's method and to put it into practice the way he suggests. And the way he suggests this should be done. And the reason for that is simple. It is because they lack the one essential skill that is needed to use not only Kotov's method, but any other method you may come across as well. So, is there any merit in Kotov's method anyway, you might ask? After all, this is just one man's point of view, so there must be an alternative method somewhere. Once again, let's not forget this is the number 6 player in the world we're talking about, and according to his own words in the book, he learned this method from other players, and I think this is an important point. As number 6 in the world, Kotov was rubbing shoulders with the best in the world. In fact, he was one of them, and namely with players that were above him in the ranking list. So it is unlikely, although not entirely impossible, that he would go to a lesser player for an advice. For example, an out of the top 200 player, by the likes of which, funny enough, he's criticized today. So this tells us that Kotov learned about this or received indication about the validity of the concepts he later expounded on in his book, that there was some consensus about the same among the top players in the world. Once again, let me remind you, the purpose of this video is not to try and coerce you into adopting Kotov's method, but to show you why people are unable to do so and why their calculation is still lacking and what can be done about it. Kotov himself hinted in the book that only a few players had mastered the act of proper analyzing of variations in the chess game, which was, as far as I understand, his definition of calculation. So he understands the difficulty of doing this, and he laments the fact and recalls his lack of understanding of this until it was revealed to him by another player after their game. So he was simply shocked how deeply his opponent was calculating, while he himself was not seeing even half of it. Consequently, he realized that, according to his own words, and that is the quote you can see on screen, the basic condition of success is the ability to analyze a sufficient number of variations. The three conditions in order to accomplish this, he lists as follows. Accurate analysis of all variations that can be logically considered, which is his tree of analysis, the infamous tree of analysis. Confidence that you have taken into account the best moves. And the third condition is strict economy in thinking time. So what is it about this that makes this so inapplicable, according to some people, for the average player and the low-rated player? Well, if you have read his book, you must have seen some of the diagrams in it, and these are those long trees of analysis that everyone seems to be unhappy about. And it would be fairly reasonable to assume that an average player from 1500 to 1900 cannot work out all the variations that Kotov suggests that normally exist in a typical tree of analysis, and at the same time keep a steady tree-like picture in his mind the way Kotov suggests while playing. And that is a fact. We cannot really disagree with that. In fact, it is here that people give up on Kotov, and even grandmasters state that this is not how we think, without providing any alternative whatsoever, and that we are not machines, and therefore Kotov's method is simply impossible, because apparently the variations he suggests are too long or too complex. It is here that I would like you to pause the video and go to the description, where you will see a link to the press conference after the game between David Howell and Vladimir Kramnik after their game at the, I believe, 2011 London Classic. And that game was won by Kramnik, and I believe the tournament as well, if I remember correctly. So anyone that claims that this is not how we think, and that there's no need for this tree of analysis, and calculating long variations is not that important, and that's not how grandmasters think, I urge you to watch this press conference and watch carefully. It is truly the most fascinating thing I have ever seen that has to do with chess. And all the grandmasters that were commentating, who were around 2500 to high 2600s, including David Howell himself, that were there with Kramnik while he was commentating and basically showing what he saw during the game. All these people had a real Kotov moment 50 years later, when they realized the insane depth at which Kramnik was calculating. And they could not believe what they were seeing, and neither could I. Admittedly, after the game, Howell saw 1% of all that, according to Howell's words. And Kramnik did agree that the computer might show inaccuracies in his analysis, which might, of course, be the case. But the fact is, he won the game as a result of incomparably superior calculating skills to his opponent. Now, let's say you play against a machine, and even if you manage to hold on for a while, the machine will, in the end, 10 out of 10 times outcalculate you at some point, and you're going to lose. Let's now assume that you play against a much stronger opponent who might not calculate as much as the machine, but will see up to a certain point in the tree of variations. And you will see up to an earlier point, and you're simply going to lose because of this. You could lose for another reason, but let's say that the reason for your loss is him out-calculating you. Is that not a good reason to try and learn and calculate as deep as you can? And is it not true that you can only benefit immensely from this? In other words, machine or not, the objective truth about a variation lies in calculating it until the end, or as much as you can down that line of variation. So why is it that some people can calculate deeper than others, regardless of the method used? What is in fact the definition of calculation? Well, if you think about it, what is the first thing that you say to an opponent that ends the game with a brilliant combination? Or what is that your opponent says to you when on the receiving end of such combination? I did not see that. You say, I did not see that. Or they say, I did not see that. So essentially, calculation is visualizing the moves in your mind. So apparently some people's visualization skills are better than others. In that case, why are we even talking about a method of calculation when we cannot even visualize and we omit simple moves from our analysis? There is, of course, the active evaluation of the moves, which is no less important, and that is the second part of the process of calculation. But to begin with, you cannot evaluate something you're unable to visualize first. Should we not then focus on this highly essential skill before we argue which method of calculation is best? Would not just Kotov's, but any other method be rendered useless by our own inability to visualize in that case? I mean, if you take another example, imagine going to a gym and seeing someone bench pressing 200 kilograms. So obviously you will be impressed. Let's say you want to be able to do this as well. You go to them and say, hey, how did you do this? That was impressive. I want to be able to do that as well. And they come back with something like, well, you lie on the bench, you put your hands under the weight, and you push as much as you can. I mean, needless to say, such a method would be of completely no use to you because you're not strong enough to lift 1/3 of that weight. And precisely the same relationship exists between calculation and visualization. Visualization is the basic skill. It's the strength you need in order to be a successful calculator. And that is the actual lifting of the weight. And regardless of the method used, you will not have the strength to lift that weight if you do not start working on your visualization. Instead of doing this, the majority of people I know, including myself, and that is something I did in the past, and that was one of the big mistakes I made, focus their entire attention to puzzles and solving puzzles, thinking they're the key to good calculation skills, without realizing that they're trying to lift 200 kilograms without being strong enough to lift even 50. And if you think about it, do you honestly think you can realistically solve a puzzle from a position of one of Mikhail Tal's games, for example, which he himself could not solve with 1 hour on the clock? And that only begs the question, what is to be gained from such an approach? And the answer is very little. Frustration, exhaustion, no real improvement in calculation skills, abandoning puzzles altogether are the usual outcome. So what alternatives do we have, and why is such an approach almost inevitably doomed to fail? It's because solving puzzles involves both visualization and evaluation, and to be able to perform the two at the same time, when you're not able to perform one, is likely going to be unsuccessful. So what I suggest is an alternative where you only focus on visualization by looking and studying and practicing consistently with only several puzzles, up to 6 I would suggest, but I would suggest starting with 1, which you know the solution to, and you use them as a visualization exercise. By doing this, you eliminate the need to evaluate and can simply focus on visualization, simply because you know how good a line is as soon as you remember it by visualizing it, because you know what the solution to the puzzle is. I will show an example later on, and I can assure you, at whatever level you are at chess, this approach is going to help you reach the next level as it helped me. And as a matter of fact, from the 1800s to 2100s, and that is a huge rating difference, 300 points. I gained 300 points by solving one chess puzzle, or let's not say solving because I knew the solution, by working with only one chess puzzle to practice calculation and solve no other puzzles at all. And the improvement of my game was quite shocking, to say the least, and I was actually outcalculating people 200 points higher or more. And I know this might sound incredible, that such a thing can be achieved only by working with one puzzle. That is the puzzle I'm going to show you in a few minutes. But that is a fact. That is how I made the 2100s. And I highly suggest you try this, as I can assure you that probably 1% of all blitz players online, rapid players online, use this as a training tool. And I can also assure you that you will see the difference very, very quickly. So this is the position I had in mind, and that is from a game between Mikhail Tal playing white and Gitescu playing black, and this game was won by white. So what are the candidates here for white? Obviously, the knight needs to move and can either go to f6 or f4. So let's consider the inferior option, and that is this move. But after this leads to some simplification, which is not very favorable for white, given his other candidate. Even though white has some advantage here, we need to evaluate the other candidate to know which one is better. This leads to nothing tangible for the time being, perhaps a slight positional pressure. But if black places a rook on e6, then he might turn out to be still on the back foot, but kind of okay. So for the time being, we're going to conclude that this candidate can wait. And look at the other one, which is knight to f4. After knight to f4, black has two candidates here, and that is rook takes c5, which is simply not good because of bishop to g6. And now black in turn has two moves, which is f takes g6, which leads to checkmate, or king to g8, which drops the queen, which kind of leads to the conclusion that rook takes e5 is not good. So we have only one other move, which is this, which kind of hopes to somehow stay in the game by pinning the queen. What other moves does black have here? Well, let's see if he tries to, because obviously white's next move is taking on g6. There's no question about that. So black has no good move which can stop this because of this. And now again, this leads to severe trouble. And this simply cannot be good because of the multiple threats against the king, and it's reasonable to assume that this is simply losing. But if we want to calculate until the end, we go with queen f4, bishop f6, because black has simply no other good move, and then that is pretty much it. So rook to g8 is not good. And that again leaves only bishop takes e5 as the only candidate for black here. Now white has two moves again, and that is bishop takes g6 or rook takes e5. Rook takes e5, I believe Tal did not like this move because, as you will see in the game, this leads to some simplification, and white is better by keeping both rooks, because at some stage he may need to move a rook to the f file, and by keeping the rooks he simply has more options to exert pressure on his opponent. Although rook to e5 is not a bad move at all. In fact, this is the computer move here. And we can analyze this if you want. White is giving a check. Then we have f5. Then we have queen to e3. And there's no immediate win here. And this is kind of hard for white to say that, even though the computer gives it as plus 2.32, this is not as good as the move bishop takes g6. So let's say that you calculate up to that point. You may even decide that this line is not good because there's nothing tangible, and you're not a computer. So it's quite easy to assume that even Tal actually reached that point where he did not think that this was sufficient. That is why he chooses the move bishop takes g6. Now black has two moves again. King to h8. Obviously king to g8 is not good because once again he drops the queen after bishop to f5. Or f takes g6. We're going to consider both. And the more complex variation is f takes g. I just wanted to say that perhaps I should have said this at the beginning of analyzing this position, that the variations in these positions are extremely difficult to visualize, especially, or I would say for me in particular, which makes it the perfect training tool when it comes to visualization. So do not be discouraged by the fact that it is very hard to visualize this when we get to the visualization part. It's quite normal that this is difficult, and that is why that is the position being chosen. So let's see what happens after king to h8. We have bishop to f7, queen takes f7. And once again, white has the option to take with the rook here, but Tal doesn't do it precisely for the same reason, that keeping the two rooks gives him more options for pressure against his opponent. So he plays knight to g6, then obviously black has one move again, because this is simply not good. It just solidifies white's advantage, while after this move he can actually try and play for an exchange of queens with queen g7. White has queen to f4. But this attempt for queen exchange kind of leaves black with only one move, and that is to move the bishop. And the problem is that the bishop doesn't have that many good squares, and he probably offers he will offer some sort of exchange. But after this, black needs to recapture with the queen. And after rook to e4, we have rook e4, queen e5, and this is simply not looking great for black, because white can actually move the rook now. If black tries to recapture the pawn, white has some checks against the king, and with the king being that exposed, this is simply potentially losing for black. So that is why this queen exchange is not good, and that is why Gitescu does not go for this. He goes for queen to f5, centralizing the queen, and perhaps getting on a better position, on a better square for the defense of the king. In any case, this is a more active way to play, but still, this is still not good for black, and black is in severe trouble here, because after knight to g4, queen g6, we have rook takes e8, bishop takes e8, or let's see what actually happened in the game. Rook takes c8, then we have d7, and the idea behind d7 is to play the rook on e6, and that is pretty much game over, which is exactly what happened, because now the rook has to move. If the rook moves away from this rank, white queens, so black needs to play this, and after this, queen g5, rook h6, the queen has to recapture, because obviously any other move, let's say something like this, we have this, and then we have a discovery on the king. Which followed by a checkmate. For example, knight to e5, and then if the computer gives queen g5, then simply that's just losing. Let's see what happens if black recaptures with the bishop here. We have queen to e5 with a very active position, and this is almost visually completely losing for black. After this, white is making small progress. And that's game over. Now let's look at the second line, which was f takes g6. Queen g6. Now there's only one move. And now white has two moves here. Obviously, queen takes h6 is not good, because black can cover. So white should definitely go for this move. Rook takes, and now not queen h6 again, because black has king to g8, and then white has just wasted his advantage here. But queen to f6. After queen to f6, if black tries to cover, we just have this move. Once again, a very active position, and this is just completely winning for white, because now he cannot stop rook to d8. And if, for example, he plays something else, like this, for example, then The black queen cannot stay on this rank. For example, if he say goes here, then we simply have we have this just winning a pawn, maintaining a huge advantage. So that was the other line, and essentially that is the solution to this position. So that is an extremely complex example, and you can totally see how using this example over and over again can improve your calculation skill significantly. And the common mistake that people make is that when they see something like this, they see the solution, they say, wow, that was great. Great stuff by Tao. Now let's move on to the next example. And if you give this puzzle to them in a couple of weeks, or even a couple of days, they will completely be unable to solve it. So what is the point in trying to solve puzzles again and again when you are simply not able to visualize the solutions? You're not able to solve even puzzles that you have already solved before. And that is why I think working with one puzzle or up to 6 puzzles, in my opinion, with of similar complexity, can simply do wonders for your calculation. Now, what I would suggest is that you try and do exactly the same as what we just did, but without moving the pieces. And that is the actual point of this exercise. That is what you should be doing to improve your calculation. In my opinion, that is simply the best way. That is the only way for someone who does not have good visualization skills to develop visualization skills. And some people are going to tell you that, oh, you should play blindfold to develop visualization skills. How on earth are you going to play blindfold if you have basically zero visualization skills? You're back at lifting 200 kilos on the bench press by playing blindfold. That's just what I think.